Tonight on Business Talk with Jim Campbell, we've got our annual Best of Business Talk holiday show. Our producer, John Iannuzzi, has weaved some of our best segments together into one show that we hope you'll enjoy. Tonight, in the first two segments, we've got Sheelah Kolhatkar. She's the author of Black Edge, about the insider trading case related to Stevie Cohen. Won all kinds of awards and accolades this year. Our third segment will be Chris Whipple on the White House Chiefs of Staff, also one of the most influential books of the year, and he delves into the dysfunction and chaos in the Trump White House. And our final segment, Inspirational in Nature, a hero in person, Admiral McRaven, takes us through how to become successful in life, goal-oriented, make your bed every day, he calls it as a start. Inside the biggest insider trading scandal in history on the quest to bring down the most wanted man on Wall Street. That's today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Sheelah Kolhatkar is left the hedge fund world, where she was an analyst, to join the enemy, as President Trump would refer to it, the media. She's now a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, where she writes about Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and politics. Sheilah's new bestseller, which is a mesmerizing crime story as well, Black Edge, Inside Information, Dirty Money, and the quest to bring down the most wanted man on Wall Street. Welcome, Sheelah.
Great to be here.
Great to have you. Now, you were taking on a case involving the biggest fish on Wall Street, Stevie Cohen, to an extent. Did you have any trepidation about doing that? Because there's a certain amount of fear in taking him on. Wall Street firms, for instance, never even stopped doing business with him.
Of course, I was a little nervous about it and just daunted by how difficult the whole thing seemed. I first really became interested in this story at the very end of 2012, early 2013, when there was a lot of sort of anticipation in the legal world about Steve Cohen. The government had been investigating insider trading for several years. And one day, this was in November of 2012, the FBI went down to Florida and arrested one of Steve Cohen's former employees. It was a very dramatic moment. They sort of dragged him out of his house in handcuffs. And, of course, it was intimidating. The subject is a tough one for a reporter, but I was so intrigued because it seemed really clear at that moment that the government was gearing up to kind of go after Steve Cohen himself, one of the most powerful people in the financial world. And I just knew that was going to be a really interesting, rich story, but also an important one. And I tried to just put my fears aside and kind of dive in.
All right. Before we go farther, I want to read a piece of the Southern District of New York's sort of indictment when they went after SAC, the business itself. The indictment charges the management of a major hedge fund with criminal responsibility for insider trading offenses committed by numerous employees, made possible by institutional practices that encourage the widespread solicitation and use of illegal inside information, and an institutional indifference to unlawful conduct, resulting in insider trading that was substantial, pervasive, and on a scale without known precedent in the hedge fund industry. That's pretty brutal, isn't it?
Yes, that was sweeping language, and it was a remarkable indictment because it came at the end of this multi-year investigation, and there had been all this drama built up around the question of whether they would charge Steve Cohen himself. They had linked multiple former and even one current employees of Cohen's with insider trading. They had evidence kind of connecting him in some cases to it. They had two guys about to go to trial for insider trading that they were allegedly responsible for doing at SAC. But when this all kind of came to a head in the summer of 2013, Steve Cohen's lawyers went down to the Southern District and made this big presentation for all the prosecutors. They were there for 4 hours. They gave out these binders. And they tried to persuade them not to charge Cohen. And their argument really boiled down to the fact that they said, you just don't have a witness who will take the stand and testify against Steve Cohen, and that was true. And the prosecutors had to go back to their offices and kind of debate and wring their hands about what to do. And the whole world was watching to see if Cohen was going to get charged. And in the end, they charged the company, which was still a kind of a big deal. But it left many people unsatisfied because Cohen himself, his life was really barely disrupted.
Yes, and we should say that they shut down SAC Capital and it had become a family office where he couldn't take outside money, which is known as .72 asset management. It's a great credit to your book that it reads like a mesmerizing, thriller, even though people know the ending, the government unsuccessful in taking him down personally. I know you're a media person, so you might not want to answer this, but is there any doubt in your mind that he was personally culpable, Steve Cohen, for insider trading?
Well, that is of course a very key question. Listen, I mean I don't know the answer. I was not in his mind, and I cannot speak to what his knowledge or intent was at any given moment. I mean, I can tell you, having immersed myself in all this evidence for a long time, it certainly seems that he should have known what was going on at his firm. He's a very smart guy. He was, and I'm sure still is, a very rapacious consumer of information. He was sort of a micromanager. He really wanted to know everything that all his traders were doing. He got very angry if people didn't share their trading ideas with him. And he was just controlling, so it's hard to believe that he would really just be oblivious to what was going on under his own nose.
Tell folks.
So that's the most I can really say. I mean, it just sort of looks bad on paper.
I think you've said more than I expected. So what is how would you define black edge for people that don't know what that means?
Yeah, the first thing you need to understand is that hedge funds really need information to do what they do. Most of them, I mean, hedge fund traders are trading in the market every day, and they're just hungry for information about these stocks so they can try and make bets that will be profitable. And so they're all out there trying to get good information about publicly traded companies, and they call that information edge. So if you have edge on a stock, it means you have figured something out, you've pieced something together or done some little extra piece of research that maybe others in the market don't have, and that's going to give you a little advantage when you go to trade that stock. So that's your edge. So a group of traders at SEC Capital had a system for rating different kinds of information. There was a boss there who would teach this to his employees. There was white edge, which was publicly available, easy to find information, like a company's SEC filing. And frankly, that kind of information is not that valuable to a trader because it's already, priced into the stock, as they say. There's gray edge, which is a lot of what these people traffic in every day, frankly. I mean, it's just not clear what kind of information it is. I mean, it might be, a conversation you had with an executive at a company that was a little bit vague, but gave you an indication of something, and you might not be sure. Is it okay to trade on that? You might need to ask your legal counsel for advice. And then there was black edge, which was clearly inside information, such as confidential drug trial results before they are publicly released.
In my mind, and maybe I'm being cynical here, he was worth $9 or $10 billion at this time. He paid a total of $2 billion fines. If somebody told me that I could pay a 22% tax on getting a lot of illegal information, that's a good business strategy.
There are certainly people who see it that way, and I think that is why there is a sense of frustration about the story and the way it ended. And in a way, I think the Steve Cohen story is the story of our time because, as we've seen with the financial crisis as well, it seems extremely rare, or perhaps it might never happen, that very senior level people in the financial world face any kind of severe penalty for criminal activity that happens on their watch. I mean, there's been a real rise of sort of corporate impunity, many people believe. And even after the financial crisis, all the big banks and so on, where it seemed very clear to everyone watching that there was just rampant fraud going on and mismarking of mortgage bonds and all sorts of financial pain and suffering afterwards, but no one was even charged with anything at any senior level at any of those banks. They all dispensed with those problems through fines. And in those cases, they really are unfair because it's shareholders who are paying those fines. And in Steve Cohen's case, he just wrote a check, and he was the sole owner of SAC. SAC Capital stands for his initials, Stephen A. Cohen. And he wrote a check, and he still had $10 billion basically left afterwards. So a lot of people look at that and think that is not really justice. And meanwhile, the lower level people, some of them ended up going to jail.
Yeah, it's kind of ugly, and I fault the Preet Bharara's group in part for not going after the mortgage folks more. I'll say to me, an indictment. He had a 30% compound growth rate for, some say, even up to 30 years. To me, mathematically alone, that's not really attainable unless you're cheating. And they'll say there are so many folks in the organization and a few bad apples. But as Buffett will tell you and others, 5% of your trades determines basically your return, your alpha. So a lot of that gain could have come from illegal trading. Am I right or wrong?
Well, again, it's hard to know for sure. I mean, certainly many of SEC's competitors on Wall Street felt that way. They were many of them were kind of confused as to how the firm was able to generate these incredible double-digit returns year after year. In fact, by the time all of this sort of legal drama came to fruition, I think SEC had only had one down year in its entire existence, and that was 2008, when, of course, everybody had a really tough year. That was the height of the financial crisis.
You're listening to the Best of Business Talk with Jim Campbell, our holiday show, weaving our top segments together. We'll be right back with our second segment with Sheelah Kolhatkar, Black Edge, and Stevie Cohen, Insider Trading. We're back with Sheelah Kolhatkar. She's the author of Black Edge. It's about Stevie Cohen's insider trading case. All right, there's the old walks like a duck, quacks like a duck. Do you think that Steve Cohen should have faced personal criminal liability?
What do I think he should have? That's a tough question. On one level, the whole thing seems, when you look at it, very profoundly unfair. And as I said earlier, it's a story of our time of profound unfairness in our economy. At the same time, they really did not have the goods. And certainly from his perspective, if they didn't have it, why should he possibly go to jail for that? And it's partly the government's fault, too.
And let me ask about the government there. Did they become, they'd had such a huge winning streak, I think 89-0 or something. Did they become too risk-averse and just so scared of losing that they wouldn't go for it?
Well, there are definitely people who believe that. I think it is a problem that they became a little bit enamored with the idea of just winning all the time. And Preet Bharara, who is the U.S. attorney in Manhattan leading many of these cases, he was getting so much attention in the press, and they were calling him the Sheriff of Wall Street, and he was doing these press conferences, and his face was on the cover of Time magazine. And I think, frankly, who wouldn't enjoy that a little bit? And the thought of taking a big risk on this case that may or may not work out well was not appealing, and that does affect their decisions when they're deciding which cases to pursue and who to go after. And there are many critics who believe that they continued with the insider trading cases because they felt like a sure thing and neglected more complex and risky financial fraud cases that might not have led to a predictable positive outcome for them.
Now, we've had these rulings that have overturned some of these cases, the Newman ruling. David Gannick is suing. You just talked about the appeal that might be accepted. Now there's a lot of pressure with President Trump to scrap a lot of Dodd-Frank. Are the regulatory restrictions loosening such that we could be back to business as usual?
We now live in a time when most people in the United States are encouraged to put their money in the stock market for their retirement. We all have 401ks, and there are no more pensions. So we're all in there in the stock market. And there's all sorts of stuff going on that really undermines the integrity of the market. And it's very interesting to me now to see what Trump is doing because, of course, he seemed very kind of anti-Wall Street when he campaigned, but now he's installed, multiple Wall Street financiers from hedge fund world, private equity, Goldman Sachs executives to direct our policy, and they seem very intent on really dramatically rolling back regulation. And the last time that happened really was during the George Bush presidency, and there was a real deregulatory philosophy ruling. And the SEC, for one, was run by someone who thought the market could regulate itself, and the SEC was sort of discouraged from being aggressive. And during those years, we had the mortgage fraud bubble inflating, and we had a huge spread of insider trading among hedge funds. And then that ended with the financial crisis blowing up and all of these hedge fund cases. And I just think people should remember that and make it clear that we don't want to go back there.
We seem to have a short memory in this country generally. Now, of course, Steve Cohen is now running Point72 Asset Management, a family office, but there's a chance that fairly soon that he could go back to taking public money. Is that a good thing?
Well, I think it says a lot about the world. It seems to me that investors will return to him. I've heard this from potential investors or former investors. They're so desperate for a sure thing that I think many of them may well overlook what happened in the past and take his argument that, it was a few bad apples and put money with him again. And, I personally find that a little surprising, but he's taken a lot of steps to try and distance himself from the scandal and has tried to really tighten up his firm, improve compliance and all that. And we'll have to see if it worked.
And I think from our looking into it, they've been very sincere at what they've built in this new Point 72. In an after-action, bigger picture thing, Warren Buffett, claims that hedge funds don't add any value. They just take a lot of fees out of things. Where are you on that big picture? Is Wall Street and hedge funds, are they adding real value at the end of the day?
Well, I don't want to paint all hedge funds, obviously, with the same brush because there are thousands of them. However, they would all say, well, we add liquidity to the market. We help bring kind of transparency to prices in the market by doing all this research and trading stocks. And they do manage, in some cases, pension fund money of teachers and civil servants. However, I find it a little odd that we have decided as a society that these jobs are going to be the most highly compensated jobs in our economy. There's very, very little else you can do to make so much money so quickly. And, the top hedge fund managers on the list every year are making over $1 billion a year. And,
is that more than you make at the New Yorker?
Yes. I think it's more than almost 99% of anyone in the world makes. And what is it that they're doing that is so valuable to our society that is worth $1 billion a year?
Is that also, could I draw the line about misallocating our top business school talent so much to Wall Street? You mentioned Martoma, for instance, could have been a doctor.
There's been an enormous flow of the best and brightest students out of top colleges and math and engineering programs and everything into hedge funds chasing this money. The funds hire relatively few people. Many of them are paying, different taxes from the rest of us who earn salaries. There's a real argument to be made. Many of them do give away money through pet charity projects, but really, as a whole, what are they contributing to the greater good, and what are they taking away? And
all right, as we get down to the end, and we're going to talk about this later, but Herbalife was a alleged pyramid scheme that the FTC had a chance to take down. SAC was a hedge fund that the feds could have taken down. Neither of them ended up getting taken down, did they? Even though they looked obviously guilty.
I think it really just shows you that it's very hard. It's very hard to go after these really powerful entities for a variety of reasons. I think it helps explain why things seem so broken in Washington. Frankly, both of these stories.
Very interesting. And the book is mesmerizing. It's Black Edge, Inside Information, Dirty Money, and the quest to bring down the most wanted man on Wall Street. It's been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Stay with us now. Again, you've got the Best of Biz Talk with Jim Campbell. Tonight, our top segments weaved together. Third segment will be Chris Whipple on the White House Chiefs of Staff. He'll cover every chief of staff since Bob Haldeman in the Nixon administration. You're listening to the Best of Business Talk with Jim Campbell, our holiday show, weaving our top segments together. See Chris Whipple on the White House Chiefs of Staff. All the White House Chief of Staffs since Bob Haldeman in the Nixon era. Chris Whipple is an acclaimed writer, journalist, documentary filmmaker, and speaker. Got a provocative new book out. It's gaining buzz by the day. The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. Welcome, Chris. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
As goes the White House Chiefs of Staff, so goes the presidency. Is that kind of what you've come up with?
It's really an incredible story, and it's stunning to me that nobody's ever written this book before, because when you think about it, it's really the untold story of these 17 living White House chiefs, all of whom I spoke to. And yeah, one of the lessons that comes through in the book is that every president learns, sometimes the hard way, that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House Chief of Staff as first among equals in the White House. And we can talk about some of the reasons why, but modern history is littered with the wreckage of presidencies that didn't understand that.
Just briefly before we jump in, what's the job description?
Well, it's hard to exaggerate how important it is. I mean, the chief wears a lot of hats. He is, of course, famously the gatekeeper, the guy who controls access to the Oval Office and really creates time and space for the president to think. He's the president's closest confidant, or should be. He's the guy who controls the information flow and is therefore the honest broker who tees up every issue with information on every side of a decision. That's just for openers. I mean, it's impossible to overstate how fundamental that role is.
I thought it was interesting, the comment that, every president puts 3 pictures in his office that kind of reflects who their ideal role model was. And the pick of the chief of staff is almost a reflection of their inner security, right? Will they take someone and empower them, take somebody who might know more than them, et cetera?
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, it was Richard Norton Smith, the historian, who told me that, every president reveals himself by the portraits he hangs in the Roosevelt Room and the guy he chooses as chief. And, this book is not just, The Gatekeepers is not just a book with lessons about White House management. It's really the story of these unbelievable characters. I mean, Aaron Sorkin couldn't have dreamed these guys up, from H.R. Bob Haldeman under Nixon through Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, James Baker, Leon Panetta, Rahm Emanuel, and, of course, up to the present. So I've tried to really humanize these guys, and they tell all kinds of stories that you've never heard about the presidents they served.
I noticed in going through them, we've had 17 of them since Nixon. We've got governors, CEOs, politicians, legislators, best friends, outsiders, OMB guys, and SOB guys, and guys that are relatively anonymous that we haven't heard of. Did you find any commonalities across all of that? Yeah,
there are commonalities among the worst chiefs, and there are commonalities among the most effective chiefs. Just for openers, we've all heard about Don Rumsfeld's rules, but Jim Baker, who is by all accounts the gold standard among chiefs, has a few rules of his own that are interesting. And what he told me, and it's turned out to be true over recent history, is that principals, people who have been CEOs or governors, accustomed to ordering people around, having lots of power, tend to be a bad fit as chief of staff. I mean, the most important word in the title is staff, not chief. You've got to be able to. You can't make the mistake of thinking that you're the CEO, that you're calling the shots. You have to serve the president. Among successful chiefs, I would say, Jim Baker for Reagan and Leon Panetta under Bill Clinton. Those are guys who were really grounded. They were comfortable in their own skin. They didn't have anything to prove. They'd been around the block. They were temperamentally suited to it. They weren't afraid to walk into the Oval, close the door, and tell the president what he didn't want to hear.
This leads well into, especially where you started there. Let's deal with the least effective chief of staffs first, and a little bit more on that besides what the principal aspect, whatever you would go with.
I think the consensus on the worst chief without a doubt would be Donald Reagan. For people who have forgotten about Donald Reagan, he succeeded James Baker as Ronald Reagan's chief. Baker was burned out after 4 years as chief of staff. It's the most grueling, thankless, unrelenting job imaginable. One day, Don Reagan, who was the Treasury Secretary, said, hey, Jim, let's swap jobs. It was the most disastrous job swap in American political history. Don Reagan came in. He was a former Merrill Lynch chairman. He was imperious. He was arrogant. He was regal. He famously boasted that if a sparrow landed on the White House lawn, he would know about it. But he somehow didn't notice this harebrained scheme that was being hatched in the White House basement that became the Iran-Contra scandal. The Iran-Contra scandal never would have happened on Jim Baker's watch, in my opinion, and that's how consequential the choice of a White House chief can be.
Fascinating. I want to go to something that intrigues me in this book. You see Rumsfeld and Cheney save the Ford presidency by putting in a system, and yet Cheney and Rumsfeld seem to completely undermine the chief of staff system in the George W. Bush administration.
Well, it's a great story because, for openers, Dick Cheney, when he was the 34-year-old chief of staff to Gerald Ford, was a completely different guy. He was, believe it or not, the most popular guy in Washington. Yeah. And so I try to solve the mystery of what happened to Cheney in this book. But you're right that when Andy Card became chief of staff in Bush 43's White House, boy, he might have had mission impossible in terms of being an empowered chief because, A, Bush 43 didn't empower him, and B, he was up against very savvy, smooth operators in Cheney and Rumsfeld.
You're listening to Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Our final national segment is on deck next. Can a Trump presidency succeed without an empowered chief of staff? So let's get right to that question. Can Trump succeed without an empowered chief of staff, and with his personality, can he even have an empowered chief of staff?
Well, think about it in historical terms. Jimmy Carter was possibly the most intelligent president of the 20th century. Ronald Reagan was once called unfairly an amiable dunce. But Reagan understood something that Carter did not, and something that Trump has not grasped at this point, and that is that you have to have an empowered White House chief as first among equals. I don't see any evidence that Trump understands that. I think he's apparently oblivious to history, hasn't learned those lessons, but I think that if he wants to have a chance of governing effectively, he's going to need to do that.
Interestingly, the rumors was that Kasich could have been offered the vice presidency, and he would have been able to be sort of like a chief operating officer on both domestic and the foreign policy side. There's also Chris Christie hanging out there, but he fits your principal mode. Is there someone that you could see that even could do the role?
I don't want to get into names, and I'm not sure. I'm the person to be choosing chiefs for Donald Trump. But what I can tell you is just sort of the patterns that I've seen and that I talk about in the book. You really need to have somebody, somebody like a Jim Baker or a Leon Panetta who can execute your policy, but most importantly, walk in, close the door, and tell you what you don't want to hear. Don Rumsfeld told me that the White House Chief of Staff is the only person other than the president's wife who can do that, who can go in and deliver a really tough message. Cheney put it pretty well. He said, you can't have 8 or 9 guys sitting around with a really tough message for the president saying, oh, it's your turn to do it. No, it's your turn to do it. No, I did it last time. That's a recipe for failure.
Well, that was a fast hour. Let's hope that President Trump reads the book, or that somebody around him does. Thanks to Chris Whipple. And that book, again, is The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. A lot of new revelations, and no one's ever done this before. Chris's website is chriswhipple.net. This has been Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Now we'll be back with our final Best of Business Talk segment right after this. Admiral McRaven, Make Your Bed, How to Become Successful in Life. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from the folks at Business Talk with Jim Campbell, John Iannuzzi, our producer, Michelle Gibson, our marketing director, and I'm your host, Jim Campbell. Happy holidays, everybody. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from all of us at the Best of Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Thanks to Admiral McRaven. Make Your Bed, How to Become Successful in Life. And we're back with Admiral Bill McRaven. He's got a book out, Make Your Bed, Little Things That Can Change Your Life. And maybe the world.
Point about making your bed, but the other life lessons really apply whether you're in the military. You know, it doesn't make any difference what your race or your gender is or your orientation. And this was the point I brought out in the speech, is these are life lessons, and I think that's why they have really resonated so well with the public.
The whole SEALs and the BUDS training and everything, and the survival rate of guys that get through that program seems so low and so differentiated. It just strikes me as really fascinating that you can bring it right into everybody.
Well, again, it is a little bit of, as I used to say, life jammed into about 6 months. So basic SEAL training is 6 months long. But in the course of that 6 months, again, much like life, you're going to fail. You're going to have those dark moments. You're going to learn lessons about life, like making your bed. So, you know, when you take a look at what we as young SEAL aspirants learn going through training, it really did set you up for the rest of your career, or frankly, the rest of life.
Does everybody go in there feeling I'm not going to get through this?
No, I think just the opposite. I think everybody goes into it. I hope everybody goes into it thinking they're going to make it. I think then all of a sudden they're confronted with the reality of, well, you know, maybe I didn't quite have the toughness, the mental toughness I thought I had to make it through. I certainly know I went into it assuming I was going to make it through. And I don't think at any point in time in SEAL training did I really doubt that I would make it through, because I just was prepared to, you know, not quit. People often ask me, what is the secret of SEAL training? You know, how fast do you have to be? How strong do you have to be? I said, look, it's none of those things. The secret of SEAL training is just don't quit.
Yeah.
If you don't quit, then you'll make it through.
Okay, let's just start with that. The make your bed example. Tell us exactly what you mean. And I was reminded, Bill Parcells, you know, the famous Giants coach.
Sure.
He used to say, no medals for trying. And this is kind of like do your job, right?
Well, it was a little bit more than that. So every morning in SEAL training, we would have to go in. We'd have a uniform inspection, and they would inspect our room, which, of course, included our bed. And we had a very simple Navy rack, you know, and it was just a single bed. It had just a single mattress on it on a steel frame. But you had to make the bed to exacting standards. So you had to have the 45-degree hospital corners. You had to have the second wool blanket exactly aligned with the bedpost at the end. The pillow had to be centered right at the top. And then, of course, the bed had to be very, very taut. And you know, I didn't quite understand when we got there. We all wanted to be, you know, hardened SEAL warriors. And the first thing they're trying to teach you is to make your bed. And of course, it took me a while to understand the value of that. But the point they were making, I think there were 2 points they were making. One, this really was our first task of the day. And so you got up every morning and you had to make your bed. And when you made your bed, and when it was the first task of the day, it really gave you some impetus to go on and do the next task and the next task and the next task. But the other piece of this was, hey, it's a little chore. It's not hard. Make your bed. And if you can't do the little things right, how are you ever going to do the big things right? How are you ever going to lead a SEAL mission if you can't even make your bed correctly? There were a number of points that I think the SEAL instructors were trying to make as they, quote unquote, encouraged you to make your bed. And of course, if you fail to make your bed right, then you paid the price by having to run out into the surf zone, get wet, and roll around in the sand and become a sugar cookie.
Yeah, I always say that the other good thing about this is you could have a really bad day where everything goes wrong, but this is one built-in success every day.
Right.
If you do it, you know, if you make the bed the way it should be. I want to talk about standing up to bullies now, because it segues into some other stuffs. Tell us about that one.
In this case, it was a bit of an analogy, but a true analogy. So when we get out to San Clemente Island, so when I went through SEAL training, San Clemente Island was the third phase of training. And very early on in our time out of San Clemente Island, we had to do the night swim, and it was considered the swim with the sharks. And so prior to the swim, the instructors would call all of the trainees into the classroom, and they'd say, okay, you know, we're going to start at this point, and you're going to be swimming, and I think it was a 3-mile swim. And they would always tell you, but look, there are a lot of sharks out there. And part of this was kind of a scare tactic on the part of the instructors. But then they said, look, if you see a shark beginning to circle you, don't try to outrun the shark. You're not going to swim faster than the shark. So stand your ground, get back to back with your swim buddy, and then as he circles, the circle will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then the shark will come at you, and then you have to punch him in the nose, punch him in the snout, and they'll go away. And of course, we believe that because the instructors told us to believe that. And there is actually some truth if you look at how to deal with sharks in the open water. But the point of that really was the analogy of bullies. Everybody's got bullies in their life. You're going to have schoolyard bullies. You're going to have bullies in the workspace. And I can tell you, having traveled all around the world, there are tyrants and dictators that are bullies. And if you want to set things right, you have to stand up to the bullies. You can't back down from them. You can't outswim them in many cases. You can't run away from them. Sometimes you just have to stand your ground and punch them in the nose.
In fact, I was going to segue right to there. You dealt with some bullies, particularly in your last job, and you did write in the book, "Without courage, men will be ruled by tyrants." You got Saddam, and I thought it was interesting that you felt one of the strategies to break the bullying down was to make him feel like he wasn't important anymore. What did you do exactly?
Well, he had been, of course, the president of Iraq, the ruler of this country. He lived in a giant palace. He had generals and handmaidens and everything going for him. And after he was captured by U.S. troops, we held him for about a month in a very small room. He had a cot. I kept a guard in there, but I didn't let anybody see him because I think he felt that, people will come to visit me. The new leadership of Iraq will come to visit me. Important generals will come to visit me. Reporters will come to visit me. And, of course, I ensured that no one came to visit him. I would come in every day just to check on him to make sure that he was healthy and well, but I wouldn't even speak to him. And after a while, he realized that he was no longer important. And this was a little bit, I think, about how you have to deal with bullies, is if they think the actions they're going to take are going to make them more important, then they tend to want to do those things. And sometimes you just have to make sure the bullies recognize that you're no longer important. And in the case of Saddam, because we had nobody come talk to him, because he was essentially alone and isolated, after a while you saw that cockiness really go away pretty quickly.
We've had a great fast hour, 10 little things that can have a big impact. It is a life-changing book, and I hope at minimum everybody starts making their bed well. And I want to thank Admiral McRaven for his service. Obviously, an honor to have him here. We hope you've enjoyed the Best of Business Talk 2017, our top segments. Thanks to our producer, John Iannuzzi, for putting this all together. I'm Jim Campbell. We'll be back for another edition of Business Talk with Jim Campbell.